second panel has a title which is Death and Taxes, and there is an expression in English that there are two things that people cannot avoid, and it is death and taxes. But of course people do everything possible to avoid both taxes and dying, and that's completely normal, and we have to remember this is how things are. So this is the title of our, the theme of our panel, and I will start. Our keynote speaker is John Haralambakis, who I think that many of you already know because he has been a presenter in the previous free market roadshows. And John is the managing director of Black Summit Financial Group. So, John?
Is it better? Very good. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be among you this evening. And before we go through some slides, not that many, I would like to emphasize that I believe we are entering a period of triple zeros. And what do I mean by saying triple zeros? Zero inflation, zero growth, zero productivity growth rate. And we all know that unless there is productivity growth rate, then there is no growth. And if there is no growth, there are no incomes, there is no job growth, and therefore we have stagnation. I certainly reject the theories of secular stagnation, because there is no such a thing as secular stagnation. The economy is dynamic, and therefore, if the economy is dynamic, can always grow at its maximum potential. So the question is, why do we experience zero productivity growth rate? Why do we experience zero growth rate? And why do we experience zero inflation? And I would say the answer to this triple dilemma, the triple zeros, is number one, because we have too much government. Whether you define too much government as the size of government in terms of public sector employees, or too much taxes, we have way too much government, and unless we reduce the size of the government, we cannot experience growth. Why do we have zero productivity growth rate? And I'm not referring only to Greece, I'm referring to the whole European Union. It's because we have too much regulation. And unless we reduce the regulation, we cannot experience growth in productivity. Even in the United States, which is less regulated than the European Union, the unfortunate thing is that in the last decade, check it out, you will find it to be so, the productivity growth rate is between 0.9 and 1%. Dismal. Absurd. While in the previous decade, from 1995 to 2005, the productivity growth rate was close to 2.8 or 3%. Government regulations in the last 10 years, even in the United States, increased, and therefore productivity growth rate has decreased. And the third zero is the zero inflation, and that the suspect there are central monetary authorities, which eventually have pumped too much monetary base, not money supply, monetary base, which eventually has created the bubbles and the financial catastrophe that is coming. Because if you think that 2008 and 2009 was a catastrophe, wait until you see the next one. So, in order to proceed, actually I will pass this and I will close with this graph. We talked about FATCA. And in a cost-benefit analysis, at least in the United States, 8 billion was collected, 8 billion was eventually spent. So what's the benefit out of FATCA? Zero. We created a big zero. Under FATCA and all the other government taxes, international competitiveness eventually undermines the productivity of a nation, undermines international tax competition, and therefore undermines innovation. When there is no innovation, there will be no Google, there will be no Facebook, and no growth. And in terms of tax innovation, I would say that, I know that you may not be able to read this table, but it's coming from the International Tax Competitiveness Index, and you will see that countries in the European Union well-known countries like Italy and France, or even Greece, Japan, the United States, are at the very bottom of tax competition because of too much taxes and too much regulation. Now, let's see some other facts regarding compliance with the regulations that the government imposes on us and especially on corporations. The cost of compliance is approximately 1.1 trillion euros. For every law that is enacted, there are approximately 20 regulatory rules that are also issued. I call this the unconstitutionality index. And this has become a madness, because if the regulatory enterprise in the European Union were a country, it would have been the 5th largest economy in the European Union. I think that's ridiculous. Now let me give you some numbers coming from the United States, but the European Union numbers are not very different. And I'm not going to explain every single number. The number speaks for themselves. But if you look at the small or medium-sized enterprise, let's say those that have less than 50 employees, all the federal regulations in the United States cost this enterprise approximately $11,000 per employee. That's a lot of money for a small and medium-sized enterprise to pay. So how can you create jobs? How can you create competition? How eventually can you be competitive in this environment? And again, this is a practical study that was done, that if the corporate tax rate, let's say, were to be reduced from 35% to 20%, then we would have seen the tax base to increase and the tax income for the government actually to go up. Now, here are some facts regarding European Union regulations and taxation. I'm told that I have only 3 minutes, but if we add all the other minutes from the other page, I think I have about 8. For 21 years running, the European Court of Auditors has refused to give a clean bill of health because of irregularities and fraud, and therefore the European Union does not have a clean bill of health from the auditors they have appointed. Motocrosses, for example, are declared as arable land that receive subsidies. And this kind of tax harmonization across the European Union eventually will reduce even more productivity and innovation. So let me close with this slide that eventually I created last week, that shows the consequences of too much centralization. So we have 2 central authorities eventually. We have the federal authorities and we have the central bank authorities. When there is too much central government, eventually there are 4 things that are happening. There are power issues, and power eventually corrupts. There is a clientele mentality that the Greek society has experienced too much. Eventually you become a clientele of the party, and the party gives you a job, and eventually productivity goes to hell. There is too much bureaucracy, and we just hear that it takes 6 months to start a small business. And there are too many taxes and too many regulations which eventually misallocate capital. Capital misallocation eventually is the suicide of any nation. All these eventually lead to stagnation. Stagnation is the effect, it's not the cause. If you have too much power in the central monetary authority, whether that's the Fed or the European Central Bank, which is an absurd notion, then you have an absence of an anchor. And let's remember, every time a nation abandons an anchor, financial disaster comes. If we look at when the nations abandoned the anchor in 1971, we had the 1970s crisis. The 80s crisis eventually were the outcome of the 1970s. Then we had the 1990s when the era of bubbles was created, and then we have the derivatives crisis, which we experienced in 2008, and which the tsunami is coming pretty soon. I would say probably in the next 2 or 3 years. So all this too much power in the hands of central bank eventually has created collateral holes. There is not enough collateral out there for all the debts that we have created. How much debt? $720 trillion. We don't have the money, we don't have the assets. Eventually, as the top chief US spy testified to US Congress 2 months ago, we're going to hell. So all this, between the stagnation created by the central government and eventually the collateral force created by the central banks, are brewing the next crisis. So we're going to have a pension crisis, not just in Greece, but throughout the European Union and down the road in the United States. We are coming down to another major financial crisis. We have the debt crisis. Greece has experienced the debt crisis, and now it's brewing also a geopolitical crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our next speaker is Michael Williams. Michael is the founder of Aldous Financial, a registered investment advisor and certified financial planner in Denver, Colorado. And Michael speaks frequently about economic history, the morality of capitalism and individual rights, financial markets, and investment planning.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. I love this country and I love this city. I'm a bit disappointed, but I've never been here before. But I want to tell you that I have loved the country of Greece and the city of Athens for a long time. And it's because it's the birthplace of so many things. Primarily, in my mind, it's the birth of the human mind. And I'm here to tell you that I have a different take than many of the speakers regarding some of the issues that we're dealing with. My belief is that if you're for free markets, that you have to understand what capitalism is, and you have to make a moral case for it. Not only in terms of thinking like an entrepreneur as a business person, but thinking like an entrepreneur as a human mind and someone who's creative. I run a program called the Defenders of Capitalism Project in Denver, Colorado, and we basically train politicians on what is capitalism. Does it work? The historical and moral foundations of it. And most importantly, as I said, the moral foundation, is it good? Is it actually something that's good? I think that's the problem right now. I think that most people understand that it works, but most people believe it's not so good. And so they're unwilling to completely defend it on moral grounds. They make the case continually about the practical necessity of having business people own their own property, of individuals being able to act freely. But they don't say this is good. They say it's selfish and greedy and bad. That's our problem. We need a moral and intellectual revolution. So capitalism is basically, I'm not trying to really explain this to people in the room, but I think it is crucial for most people out there to understand more clearly what capitalism is. It's not just commerce. It's not just having private property. It's owning yourself and what you produce. It's having a right to your life. So the essence of the moral argument comes down to this. Do we want to deal with each other as human beings by methods of force or through trade? And if we're going to do it by force, are we going to call that moral? So in that sense, we have to fight for a moral role for government. We continue to say the government's too big. I think we need to change that to say the government is improperly outside of its role. The issue is it correct to have the initiation of force upon individuals? I contend that that's immoral. That the only moral basis to working with people is through trade. I'm going to skip ahead to some of this. You guys know the rule of law. Although, it's said that Greece is the birthplace of democracy, and that's a good thing. I challenge that. The Greek people are voting for, and this isn't just the case in Greece, this is the case now in the entire world, and it's true of the US. We're voting for the violation of our fellow citizens' rights. Let's have a little exercise in democracy right now. Let's take a vote. How many of the people in this room think that you have a right to an education? How many people in this room think you have a right to health care? How many people in this room think you have a right to a dignified retirement? So lots of people are voting for this. Okay, when you vote for that, who's going to provide it? Who's going to pay for it? Do you want someone to have a right and to use the gun to provide that value? These are all values. Education, healthcare, retirement. These are all things that are of value to you. Who's going to provide that? Your government? How is your government going to do that? They're going to use a gun. Maybe you don't see the gun, but that's what the law is. The law is force. The law is using the force of taxation, regulation, and so forth to take property from someone to give it to another person. I call that immoral. I'll call that wrong. There's no trade involved there. That's force. The history of capitalism is, over the last 1,000 years, looks like this. This is basically a timeline for 1,000 years, and the good all of a sudden exploding upward. Does anyone recognize this graphic? It boils down to, from the year 1000 through the year 2000. I call it the good, but it actually is a life expectancy timeline. So why did we have an explosion of life expectancy? Why do we have an explosion in virtually any way you measured the good? Per capita income, home ownership, transportation options, the environment getting better, infant mortality going down. Every way you measure human happiness and health and well-being in the free world, this free world I call the capitalist world, has improved explosively as opposed to the prior 1,000 years, where life was nasty, brutish, and short. What happened? Well, we had the freeing up of the human mind. Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith, two different philosophers on two different continents with two different ideas, but both two sides of the same coin: political freedom and economic freedom. This is really the birth of capitalism in a sense. Force or trade, that's the option. Now, the panel's topic was about taxes. But the taxes are really a gun to not only the entrepreneur, but any productive human being's mind. And we just continue to see those things grow. Well, that means your mind will shrink or run away. And that's what we're having not only in Greece, but worldwide. Wherever you have more force being used, you have the mind running away. The productive, creative, innovative human mind that creates all those goods. What's amazing is that it's ironic in human relationships that the more you focus on the collective, the worse the collective is off. The more you focus on the morality of the individual to keep his earnings, his property, the more the collective benefits. So I say that it is good. I think you have a concept called eudaimonia, human thriving. This is the good. And if you want more of the good, you should be advocating for laissez-faire capitalism. Thank you very much.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm very happy of being here. This is my third time visiting Athens, and I'm very thankful to the Liberty Forum that they have asked me to talk here. But I'll be very briefly. Well, Argentina in the past 12 years, it has changed recently, a few months ago, but for the past 12 years had a government which was very similar to your current government. In fact, your current government, your current prime minister took Argentina as a role model. I mean, there are many things that I like about my country. Unfortunately, not from the past years, and particularly not about its policies. So this panel is about taxes. I want to tell you some things that happened in Argentina with taxes. But to explain you what happened in Argentina with the tax system, firstly, I want to show you this graph. This shows you how and why Argentina should have been a success story in the past 12 years. Argentina's economy is very much related to the agricultural sector. We are heavy commodity exports, and the prices of commodities, in part because of things that John mentioned earlier, because of expansionary monetary policy, exploded. In 2001, when we had a very big crisis, they were very, very low, and then the prices went 30% 3-4 times above what they used to be. But why Argentina in this context? Why? Well, the reason of these pictures is Germany. We have also that in common. But why Argentina was not a success story? Why with those prices Argentina was not a success story? And the reason, one of the many reasons, but one of the most important is the tax policy that our government implemented. And you can see in these graphs what happens with taxes in Argentina. And two things that I think can come to your mind very quickly is that, like Argentina, Greece had a very big shadow economy because we have very big taxes, of course. And the second thing is that there's a tax hike coming to Greece very soon. This is what I heard. So you can see where you can end up. Argentina, probably the fiscal burden now is 50%. The services, of course, are not according to that 50% that we are paying, and many other terrible things happen with taxes. The first thing is that, yes, we charge our exporters taxes to export. This is, as far as I know, is the only country in the world that does that. And those taxes weren't low, believe me. They started being 20%, they were raised to 30% to 35%. They even tried to raise them to 90%, 90. They couldn't, thank God. But that was the idea. Of course, this is not an environment. I mean, with these ideas, charging taxes to your own exporters, you don't create an environment to receive foreign investment, for people to invest, for agricultural farmers, to say, okay, I will save and I will invest. No, you have people sending money to Panama and to many other places, and I applaud them for that. I would do that. I mean, unfortunately, I am not a farm owner. If I would have sent as much money as I could abroad. It's the only reasonable and rational thing that you could have done. The second thing was that in a high inflation environment, they never adequate the tax limits to this in high inflation. What is the consequence of this? If you own 17,000 euros, you are considered a wealthy person in Argentina, and you have to pay taxes accordingly. So if you own a very small apartment, you are rich. If you have a very reasonable salary, you are rich, and you have to pay taxes as if you were a wealthy person. This means that, for instance, if your salary is more than 17,000 euros a year, you have to pay income tax, and that income tax is 35%. The same if you own property. The third thing that they did, and probably in Greece is very similar. I know I'm not an expert, but probably is very similar for what I could hear in the first panel and from some of your comments, is that they created a tax system which is completely insane and impossible to be understood. Not even accountants know it exactly. The tax agency named AFIP in Spanish, AFIP, issues 2 new tax rules every day. Fortunately, they don't work Saturday and Sunday. But that was the case. Not even accountants could be up to that. And what the situation was that you never knew if you were paying exactly. I mean, what you have to pay for starters is very high, and you never knew exactly if you have to pay everything that you were supposed to pay. This basically created something which the government used in its favor, and you should keep in mind this, because it's something we were talking to Makis before this event starts, and really it seems that the leftist populists have some very bad person wrote like a playbook for them, and they all do the same. In Argentina, we also suffered this media law that was basically, of course, it stated good intentions, but the idea was to control the media. And the same happens everywhere that you have this sort of governments. So the fourth thing that they do was to convert the tax agency, the AFIP, into a secret police. Because you have all these very high taxes, and you have this system which is almost impossible to be understood. So everybody is basically a tax evader, a tax dodger, because really nobody either can pay the taxes, and nobody even knows how to pay them if this person could pay them. So how they use the tax agency as a secret police. If you published, for instance, this happened to many journalists and economists, if you published an op-ed against the government saying, okay, this policy that they are trying to implement is very bad, will have terrible consequences, the next day these guys will visit you, will basically turn you into a civil dead. They wouldn't kill you, but they will turn you into a civil dead person, because they will suspend for a very long time your tax number, and without that you can't do any business. So be careful, because the tax agency can become this. Before I finish, just one very simple idea. Like Churchill said, you cannot tax yourself into prosperity. And Argentina unfortunately is a proof of that. This past decade, Argentina should have been a boom, and it was a bust. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. I can really say that Greece and Argentina are quite similar, so even the tax policies we have it. So our next speaker is Randall O'Toole. He's a Cato Institute Senior Fellow working for urban growth, public land, and transportation issues.
Well, we've been talking supposedly about taxes and death, but really what people have talked about is taxes and regulation. And I want to talk about a specific kind of regulation and show how it has been extremely harmful to Europe in general, and I think Greece as well. And that is regulation of land, particularly regulation of land for housing. Now, Greece is fortunate enough to be above average in home ownership rates, although there are some countries, such as Romania and Bulgaria, that are much higher. At the same time, most people all over the world prefer to live in single-family detached homes rather than apartments. And Greece is particularly low in that kind of housing. Only about 32% of Greek residents live in single-family detached homes. About 8% live in single-family attached homes, which means 60% live in multi-family housing. In Western Europe, outside of the former communist countries, the only country that has a higher percentage of multifamily housing is Spain. So the question is, why do some countries have much lower rates of home ownership than others? Why do some countries have much lower rates of single-family housing than others? The answer is almost invariably government regulation. Government planners believe that most people should live in multifamily housing. There are various reasons for this belief, almost all of them wrong. This belief started in Britain. In 1947, Britain passed a law called the Town and Country Planning Act. And that law defined green belts around every major city in England. And it said you couldn't build in the green belts. And they hoped to make the green belts big enough that nobody would try to build beyond the green belts. Well, people did try to build beyond the green belts, and so they added more and more rules until eventually almost all of the country outside of the major cities was off limits to development. This kind of planning extended to was emulated by countries all over Europe, both in the communist nations and in the non-communist nations, and in much of the rest of the world as well. Within the urban growth, in the green belts, Britain built lots and lots of high-rise, high-density housing, the same as was built in Moscow, the same as was built in Eastern Germany, and the same of which is I see in much of central Athens. If you look around the world, much of the world is still largely owned by government. Africa, South America, Northern Canada, Alaska, Nevada, and the United States, and much of Asia. The land in these countries is owned by the government, which makes it hard to get title to land, which makes it hard to own your own home. You can own a condominium, but you don't own the land, which makes it hard to really be free. The red countries on this map show areas where the land is private, but the government controls what you can do with your land. And the controls are often very strict. You're not allowed to build in rural areas, and in urban areas, you're not allowed to build a single house. You often are required to build apartments or other high-density housing. The green areas, of which there are very few, are areas where you can own land and the government makes very little effort to try to say what you can do with your land. This is mainly the interior United States, interior Canada, Chile, and Iceland. And then we have the black areas, several countries in black. And frankly, it's because when I put together this map, I didn't know what those countries are like. Greece is one of those countries, and I leave it to you to figure out what are the land use rules that led 60% of Greek residents to live in multifamily housing. What are the incentives? What did the government do to cause that to happen when Greeks, just like people all over the rest of the world, would much rather live in single-family housing? The impact of these rules is very strong. It makes housing very expensive. For example, in London, you can get a 2-bedroom flat above a store, and it'll cost you a mere 3.1 million euros. In the United States, my home country, we can compare parts of the country which have very little land use regulation with other parts that have a lot of regulation. For example, in Oklahoma, which has very little regulation, you can buy a 116 square meter house, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, brand new house for 110,000 euros. In California, which has a lot of land use regulation, Palo Alto, California, you can buy just about the identical house, except for this one is 60 years old and probably needs a lot of updating. And the median price for a house like that is a mere 2.3 million euros, more than 20 times as much as the cost of the same house in Oklahoma City. That is the cost of government regulation. That cost is unconscionable and should not be allowed. A second problem is that when you restrain the supply on something, it makes the price a lot more volatile. It leads to bubbles. Britain never had a housing bubble before it passed these rules. Since then it has had 4. California never had a housing bubble before it passed its rules. Since then it has had 3. The housing bubble that we had in 2008 was a bubble only in cities that had lots of land use regulation. Here's what the bubble looked like in cities that didn't have land use regulation. If we didn't have that regulation, there would have been no bubble, there would have been no financial crisis, and the world would be chugging along a lot more healthy today than we are as a result of these rules. A third problem with these rules is that they lead to income inequality. A few people who own homes get wealthy, and people who don't either have to go heavily into debt to buy homes or they pay high rents. Thomas Piketty wrote this book saying that capitalism is bad because it is certain to make capitalists wealthier than everybody else. But a student or a researcher at MIT University looked at Piketty's data and he found that only housing was leading to income inequality. So the housing regulations that the left wing supports are the same regulations that are making income inequality get worse, which the left wing decries. So when you think about housing problems, and when you think about other problems in Europe, such as the problem of immigrants coming to Europe and locating in ghettos, enclaves, the reason why they're doing that is because they can't afford to live anywhere else. They can't afford to assimilate and move in next door to you because housing is too expensive. Addressing some of the deeper problems of Europe will help alleviate problems with the refugees and so on and so forth. If you like single-family housing, if you want to live in a single-family house, I urge you to go out and find out what are the regulations in Greece, why it is that 60% of Greek residents have to live in multifamily housing, and what you can do to reverse that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Randall. So our next, last speaker is Konstantinos Kaliris. Konstantinos is the new associate research director of CAPIM. So this is his first appearance in his new role. And Konstantinos is a barrister and doctor of law from Oxford.
Okay, then. Thank you very much. Official name from Athens, of course, but when I was asked to speak at this event, I thought that, well, what could I say? Because I told the guys, I'm not a tax lawyer and I don't even do my taxes. And when I handle money, the universe laughs at me. So, what am I supposed to say? Yeah, but it's not off the tongue. But you still can hear me? What about now? Good. Okay. It was that simple then. Okay. Again, I was promised that I would have 10 minutes. So I'm not against the rules. It's just that was the promise. Okay? Then I also thought that it has to boil down to the moral issue, because that's what always happens. But I got more than what I bargained for, because everyone speaks about the moral issue apparently at this event, including of course Michael, who is a professional in this thing. But at the same time, even more philosophers like Einstein were thrown at each other here. And I thought, well, then I can't say something about that. So the morality of tax avoidance, not tax evasion. By now you know the difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance, right? In the words of Dennis Healy, former Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion is the thickness of a prison wall. Okay? One is legal, the other isn't. So pretty obviously, one major moral difference between simply not paying your taxes and trying to avoid paying taxes that you consider way too high is that one is illegal, the other isn't, which means that morally speaking, there are two things that we should take into account. The first thing is that, the rule of law argument. The rule of law argument is very important, and I'm thankful for your slide, Michael, because it explains how people should respect the law. Because the law is what gives us freedom, and when we burn holes into the body of the law, then we can't expect the law to work when you need it. And when most needed is when our freedoms are restricted. So just respect the rule of law. Don't break the law. That's one huge moral difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. And at the same time, of course, it's highly likely that someone who just doesn't pay his taxes is a free rider. Okay, and that's a huge moral difference as well, because you get all the services, you stay here. It was mentioned before, I think, the lawyer who doesn't pay his taxes. We lawyers always pay our taxes, by the way. The doctor who doesn't pay his taxes, the plumber who doesn't pay his taxes, he's still here, carrying his money, and he enjoys all those services, okay, for free. So maybe he's a free rider, okay? These are the fundamental moral differences between the two. So what's left? What's left for tax avoidance? How could it be moral? How could it be moral? Let me summarize the two positions, the two backing positions in this case. This is the freedom principle, okay? The freedom principle, articulated by Lord Tomlin in the 1936 case, tax case, involving the Duke of Westminster in the UK, okay? He ruled, every man is entitled, if he can, to arrange his affairs so that the tax attaching under the appropriate acts is less than it otherwise would be. However unappreciative the commissioners of Inland Revenue or his fellow taxpayers may be of his ingenuity, he cannot be compelled to pay an increased tax. Okay? He doesn't break the law, he's just smart. Okay? He knows how to pay less, but he doesn't break the law. Okay? And then there is, let's say, the communitarian position. And the communitarian position says that tax avoidance is basically a technically legal attempt to avoid an intrinsic social responsibility. Note the wording. It's not a moral duty. It's not a legal duty. It's a social responsibility. The mere fact that you're a member of society entails that you should pay your taxes there, in the very society that you happen to live in. Okay? So this is the argument. How can you break it down? What I'm trying to do is I'll try to break it down in three pieces, three separate arguments, and show how they just don't work. Okay? Argument number one, okay, they don't break the law, but they bend the law. Okay? And it doesn't matter, it's the spirit of the law that counts, not the letter of the law that counts. But again, Michael, thank you for the slide. The slide was clear. The law has to be written. The law has to be clear. The law cannot be retracted. So in dubio pro libertate, right? If it's not forbidden, it's allowed. You can seriously tell me. Just imagine this principle applied to other cases. Like, for example, abortion is murder. Okay, it's not clear in the law, but that was what the legislator actually meant. Okay, so if you think about it, then that's also prohibited. No, if it's not in the law, it's allowed. Okay, and that's another aspect of the rule of law that we need. Okay, we need our freedom to be respected in that way. If it's not in the law, that something is not prohibited by law, then it's allowed. Okay. The second moral point is that you owe society, and that's a much better point. This is the point here. The point is that every choice we make is partly social. When you decide to become a doctor, okay, you don't become a doctor simply because you heal people, because that's also the job of a witch doctor or a shaman or a traditional healer. No, other things are attached, and they have acquired a certain social meaning. The money you make, the social status, the fact that you can basically live and work in every country. Okay, the fact that you help people in a way that's different to the way that the witch doctor helps people. Okay, these are all social notions, and they're attached to the option, and they make it more attractive. Okay, so the point is that the argument goes that since society has provided basically all that, this amazing social meaning attached to this option, then you should just stay here and keep contributing to the society that made it possible for you. Okay, just draw the analogy between that and your parents. That's exactly like your parents saying, "I help you quite a lot, much more than any government on this planet." And so that means that even if you leave, okay, if you take your money elsewhere, your business elsewhere, your family elsewhere, your home elsewhere, you still need to pay rent here in your paternal house. You still need to pay the bills. Okay, I don't care that you left. It's all thanks to me, or much of it's thanks to me. So you need to just stay here. And don't get me wrong. Supererogation is not a bad thing. If you want to do it, if you want to help, that's good. But there are limits to what your moral duty to your parents is, right? Okay, there are duties. And in this case, the duty would more or less be just pay whatever we want you to pay for the rest of your life. Okay, so I take my business elsewhere. I'm not a free rider. Okay, I still pay some taxes here, and then I pay some other taxes elsewhere. But that's the equivalent of a child living his paternal home and having a new family, a new house, okay, and paying those bills. And finally, the third moral point is that tax avoidance is only available to the rich, not the poor. So it forces inequality. And in my mind, that's a very weak argument. First of all, it's factually wrong. It's open to everybody. It's not like an exclusive club in London. It is open to everybody. It's just that the opportunity costs are too large for poor people. Rich people have an extra motive. So this is your answer to what government should do to reduce tax avoidance. Okay, just don't make it that interesting, that nice. That much of a good choice. Okay, so the rich do that more than the poor because they need to. Okay, they lose more money. That's one thing. And the other thing, of course, is that it's like cheating on your girlfriend. And then your girlfriend breaks up with you, and she cheats on her next boyfriend. And she says, something? Part of why I did it was because my ex-boyfriend cheated on me. That's partly true, I guess. But there's something in between. The free will of the person who cheated. And this goes for governments too. The mere fact that I avoided paying some taxes here and paying my taxes elsewhere does not necessarily entail that the government has to tax the poor. Okay? There are so many different things governments can do to make up for that. Okay? So there is the free will of the government in the middle. But let's just assume for a minute, and this is my conclusion here. Let's just assume for a minute that it is factually true. It is factually true that what happens is that other people get taxed more heavily when people avoid paying the taxes legally. Again, I'm thinking, how do you stop that? One way of stopping that would be to tell Bulgaria, for example, something, I don't like your tax system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enact a law or adjust my policy so that it is just as costly to have a business in Bulgaria as it is to have one in Greece. Okay, so that seems to me that's, I guess, state sovereignty. If it was that easy to just cancel out other people's policies, fiscal policies, it wouldn't be a very nice neighborhood to live in, this one on the Balkans. And at the same time, how do you stop people from doing that? How do you stop people from going to another country and start a business there? Yeah? Because again, businesses are people. Okay? It will be the equivalent of telling someone, don't work in London, don't work in Berlin, don't work in New York, because when you go and work there, obviously you pay income taxes there. So you take some of your taxes there. You have the talent to stay here and work and pay taxes here. But no, you take the taxes somewhere else, okay, legally, again. So with the exact same thing, it would be restricting people's free choice in a fundamental way, because where you live and where you work is a very fundamental part of your personality and your personal autonomy. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think it's time to close the event. So I would really like to thank all the speakers and the Austrian Economic Center for organizing this event. And of course I would like to thank all of you who were here with us on Friday evening. We really appreciate it staying so long. And we hope to see you in our next event, which is going to be in May the 11th. It's on a Wednesday. It's not on a typically the first Tuesday of the month, because May 3rd is a bank holiday in Greece, because the government decided to move it the May 1st because it was a holiday. So May 3rd is a bank holiday. So our next event is Wednesday the 11th, and it has to do with Greek-Turkish relations. So thank you very much.